Welcome to the fourth presentation session of this conference. With this, I would like to introduce the chair session person of this session. With this, I invite Dr. M. Nagalakshmi, Associate Professor, Department of English, Vistas, Chennai, India. Zeenat Barakat Ali, Merchant HUD English, Pune College of Arts, Science and Commerce, Pune, India. Dr. S. Ramanathan, Assistant Professor, Research Center in English, Varudunagar, Hindu Nadar, Sentakumara Nadar College, Tamil Nadu, India. So I call upon our first presenter for this session, Varsha Shahib Rao Ahar. And the title for her presentation is Marginalization and Resistance, a study of Anita Nair's Ladies Cove. Please assert yourself. Varsha, Miss Varsha. Miss Varsha, please assert your presence. Okay. With that, moving on to our next presenter, Shaifali Joshi, and her title of presentation is Caste Structure in Colonial Kumaon Asta, Things to Leave Behind.
Hello, ma'am.
You're audible. Do you have the paper?
Ma'am, am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible.
Okay, ma'am. Shall I start my presentation?
belong to Pakistan. I belong to Pakistan. I'm a research scholar at A University, Islamabad. The topic of my presentation is a feminist stylistic analysis of Zaitoon Bano's selected work, Lost in Her Own World, Utterly Unwanted and Unloved. So before starting my presentation, I would like to quote Alonso. According to Alonso, every study which contributes to the comprehension and interpretation of a literary work is legitimate. So every kind of study which adds something to our knowledge of any literary work, and if it makes us feel and enjoy that thing better, so that according to Alonso is legitimate and that is permissible. The aim of stylistics is basically to show that how the linguistic features of a literary work create meaning and to what extent they contribute to its overall meanings and effect. These literary features can be phonological, they can be grammatical or semantic or pragmatic. Feminism, on the other hand, it refers to a wide variety of beliefs, ideas, agendas, corrections. A very common definition of feminism that is normally it's a belief that the women should be equal to men and which are currently they are not. Feminism can also refers to any actions that promote changes to the society which are actually inclined towards ending of the patterns which oppresses women. And it also addresses social, political, cultural disparities of power and rights. One of a very good definition has been also given by Bell Hooks. Ain't I a Woman, Black Women and Feminism? According to this book, to be a feminist is a want for all the people, liberation from the sexist role patterns, domination and oppression. Okay, so what is feminist stylistics? Feminist stylistics can be defined as a sub-branch of stylistics in which the gender concerns are linguistically encoded in text. And it occurs through the employment of frameworks and models under the framework of stylistic analysis. So these perspectives are basically offered by feminist stylisticians, and they, along with other approaches, the study of language and gender on one hand, and feminism on the other hand, they sees gender in rather a very fluid and adaptable way. So my research objectives are basically to highlight feminist stylistic devices in the short story by Zaitoon Bano. And the second objective is to see that how these devices shows the elements of feminism in the short story. Significance is highlighting the applications of Sarah Mills' model to the short story and also to see the feminism through the spectrum of stylistics. Research methodology that I've taken is qualitative, descriptive in nature, and the text that has been selected is critically analyzed under the lens of feminist stylistics. So the model that I've taken in my research is basically by Sarah Mills, and it is known as the Sarah Mills model of feminism. This model actually includes the analysis at word level, at phrase and sentences level, at inference level, and at discourse level. So the first one is at word level. It deals with the with the question of gender bias at the level of words, individual words. So they focuses on general and theoretical aspects of sexism, and it also gives an account of generic usage. Then coming towards the analysis at phrase level, they analyze the language used beyond the level of the words, and they also see the phrases and sentences that how they shows a relationship, a relation to their context, to the history of their usage, and also to the background knowledge which is needed for their making sense. Then analysis at the discourse level, here the gendered analysis is seen through focusing on the very large scale structures that are at the level of discourse. So that is beyond the level of sentence and the phrase level. Now the story that I have taken it, here is a very general overview of the story. This story has been written by a Pashto female writer, Zaitoon Bano, and it has been translated by Kabil Khan in English language. So this story actually, it's very close to my heart because I'm also a Pashto speaker. And this story is also written by a Pashto speaker, and it surrounds around the Pashto culture. So that's why I have taken it as my research work. So she is a Pathan woman, a Pashto speaker, and she is leading a life of sufferings. She is very disturbed with the behavior of her in-laws, and especially to the behavior of her husband. And she has become so sensitive that she cannot even pay attention towards her son. Her husband, he was an artist, and he lives his own life of imaginations. He is very much busy in his life, and she cannot control her nerves because of his attitude. Like, she used to snatch his books in order to seek his attention, but he was very much away from her. And the basic reason was that she was not educated, she was uneducated. And later on, he also got married to another woman. So after all these happenings, she locked herself in a room, and she completely secluded herself from the world. And at the end, she thinks that if she was educated, so she would not have been, her husband would not have left her, and he would not have married another woman. So that was the reason, was her education that makes her husband to get married to another woman. So the analysis that I have done at word level, I have basically done the analysis on grammatical level. Like the women, they uses adjectives more. So she has used more adjectives in her conversation, in her story. Like the adjectives that you can see is mud, deranged, loony bin, demented, helpless, unhappy, unhinged, derangement, bound, innocent. And then she also uses nouns, which shows her miserable conditions like alienation, bin, roy, aggressiveness, complaints, annoyance. And the verbs, she also has used verbs which shows her emotions and her disturbance through her actions, like hated, abhorred, taunts, abuse, shattered. And she has also used the word husbanded has also been used here, which also shows the masculinity and the dominance of male society dominance of male in Pashtun culture. So at phrase level, again, there are many phrases. I've taken noun phrases here, which shows the influence of Pathan culture and the male dominance, like sense of honor, madhouse, demented indisposition, quiet meal, total alienation, unhappy marriage, new shackles, bound hands. These noun phrases basically shows that how she is bound by the culture, and she is bound to be submissive to the male, to her husband. She cannot progress in her life. Then at sentence level, I have done the analysis. Like you can see, yes, she was mud, and many of those schools and colleges burned to ashes where artist husband was husbanded in the magical spells of education. And then you can see that Pathans are polygamists. So here it shows that how the Pashto culture and how the dominance of male society is being evident in the sentences used in the short story. And inferences are basically implied through words or information that leads the reader to make assumptions and draw a final decision or judgment. Like as according to Bottonet, he defines inference as the key to uncovering the true meaning. So here you can see that, but the Pathan's sense of honor could not reconcile itself to her roving insanity, and she was admitted to bedlam. So here it says that at the very start of the short story, it has been used that the women in Pashto culture, they are being accused, and if they cannot break any kind of rule in the Pathan culture, and they are bound by the Pakhtun society, and they cannot go against, even if they get totally mentally lost, even if they get devastated, they have to focus on the Pathan sense of honor, and they have to be obedient towards their culture, towards their husbands, towards the male dominant society. So then at discourse level, again, I have done the analysis at discourse level. Like, if you can see that the title Lost in Our Own World, Utterly Unwanted and Unloved, this title suggests the style of the writer that is feminist. She is basically portraying the imaginary character of Shamsu, who is being presented as a lady who is bound by the shackles of Pathan culture. And it also shows the tolerant nature of a woman in Pathan culture. And that culture, they does not pay heed towards the progress and happiness of a woman in this modern age, but rather they try to make them more bound. And then the narrative of the story is purely feminist on discourse level. Like the overall text is coherent, and from the start till the end, Shamsu was dejected. She was treated ill-mannerly by her husband, by her family, and she was so much disappointed that at the end she closed herself in the room, and she did not even want to hear the voices that were around her. And this was also due to this. It was also the reason that she was not even liking her own son, and she was not paying attention towards him even, due to the behavior of her husband and her family. So like if you can see in this quote that Shamsu's form of insanity was quite different. As soon she saw them, she would calm and shut her eyes. Sometimes she couldn't tolerate even the din of their voices. The people around went on seeing all this, but today nobody knows the real reason of her demented disposition. And even at discourse level, it was also, it has been highlighted here, that she wishes that all the schools and educations in which these males, they study, and due to which they make the females feel low, and they leave their women and they get married to another female. So she wishes that may all the schools and the educational system, they get burned into ashes. Like you can see that many of those schools and colleges burn to ashes, where artist husband was husbanded in the magical spells of education. So conclusion of my work is that I have done a minute textual analysis of Zaitoon Bano, and it shows that her fiction is an acute manifestation of her feminist propensity. Her style is representative of a stance, and in short, she has achieved the unity of form and content in her fiction, where the feminism is not only reflected in the theme. That is normally when we do literary criticism or we literally analyze it, it's not only in the theme of the story, but also through the stylistic devices, and mainly through the framework of Sarah Mills model that I have used in my research work. Thank you so much. That is my work.
Actually, every aspect of social life of a woman in the society. Diversities of the ethnic, linguistic, regional, economic, religious, class, and caste group cross-cut Indian society, which is also permeated with the immense urban-rural differences and gender distinctions. Differences between the North and South are particularly significant, especially in systems of kinship and marriage in India. This research paper explores the Indian society is multifaceted to an extent perhaps unknown in any other world's great civilization. The diverse variety in Indian culture are rapidly bringing change, affecting various regions and socio-economic groups, adding the miseries to the life of typical Indian women. The themes of the man-woman relationship in the novels of Anita Desai are discussed and explored, which become the theme of writing this research paper. In the world of literature, woman means to inhabit from early infancy to the last day of the life, a psychological world which differs from the world of men. They never rebelled against the male-dominant society, which has been beautifully narrated in the selected novels of Anita Desai. The Indian woman accepted and adapted herself to the demanding circumstances. She was never recognized as a person and her ideas were never identified. The selected novels of Anita Desai gave an image of a woman in such a way that she was deprived of opportunities to prove her individuality. She was constantly reminded of her commitment to the forthcoming family and her husband. In this research paper, it was explored that the society refused to give the equal rights to the women folk. Indian women were examples for dependent figures depending on the father, husband, or to the society. The position of women underwent a metamorphic change down the years, which still persist in the background region and caste systems. It was found that the present-day women thought to destroy masculine hierarchy. Post-independence brought the change in the status of women. It was explored and found the change and revolution took place in all walks of life, and women too advanced to acquire their own identity in society. They have awakened women who inspired other women also. Anita Desai, in her novels, also revealed that after independence, stress was put on women's education. It endorsed refinement of their role in family and society. This paper explored that the women's affinity towards the education inculcated confidence, and they emerged successfully in all walks of life. The Western impact of feminism brought a drastic change among the women in India, resulting in the feminist movement, which took a new dimension. This research work explores that the women are no longer treated as property. The social changes in India have brought significant change in the structure of families and relationships. The feminist movement made women confident and independent. I have tried to find from the selected novels of Desai, which has well-defining role in defining the image of women and their importance. These novels are the medium of communication which express these changes through its characters. Broadly speaking, feminism is a dominant issue in contemporary women's thought. During the study, it was seen that the women are facing the conflicts and problems of fusing tradition and modernity. The women struggle much to seek fulfillment in marriage and in motherhood. The woman is projected as fickle-minded and equated with the lunatic and drunkard, and thus incapable of holding any household transaction. Likewise, Anita Desai, one of the major Indian women novelists, is more interesting in the interior landscape of mind than in the political and the social realities. Writing for her in her own words in an effort to discover and then to underline and finally to convey the true significance of the things. Desai protagonists are alienated persons. They are mostly women who have reached the different stages in life, from schoolgirl to the grandmother. They are delicate introverts. In some of the selected novels, it was found that women are sufferers. The narration of their sufferings was seen in the selected novels like Cry the Peacock, In the Voices in the Sea, Where Shall We Go This Summer, Fire on the Mountains, Clear Light of the Day. Desai is an important feminist novel. She peeps into the mind of her protagonist and lays bare what lurks in it. Her fictional world is just like an iceberg, mostly hidden and partly visible. In one of the novels of Anita Desai, Cry the Peacock, which is the tragic story of Maya, who is haunted by the astrological predictions of death of either the wife or husband. She has no children, and this leads to her isolation. She is segregated by society as per the astrological predictions. In effect of insane fury, she kills her husband. In another novel, Voices in the Sea, the scene shifts from Delhi to Calcutta, the goddess of the city of Kali and the goddess of death. The protagonist rebels against the conventions. And in the next novel, Where Shall We Go This Summer, portrays tragic inner reality of Sita. The cruelty and the callousness of the urban life suffocates her. In the next novel, Fire on the Mountain, focused on three women and their complex experiences in the life. In another novel, Clear Light of the Day, Desai script the history of Delhi with a Hindu family. Anita Desai presents image of woman which is totally divergent from the ones presented in her earlier novels. Finally, I conclude. Anita Desai's novels deal with women where they appear to be troubled and tormented as the milieu in which they are placed. They does not seem to be suited to their taste and aspiration. The life of the Indian woman was passive and dependent, which was explored in all her selected novels. The most pertinent issue in her novel is the condition of Indian women sequestered in a male-dominant society. The women in her novels are extremely intense. They feel and live, but are governed by a sense of fatality. In spite of that inability to maintain contact with the world, they aspire to seek harmony in it and move towards trying to achieve such harmony. Anita Desai novel does not deal with the large moments of history, but with the struggles of human soul. Anita Desai has opened a new era in the domain of psychological portrayal of character in her novels. It's a great skill in artistry that Anita Desai and her work has such an enthusiastic following everywhere. Focusing on Anita Desai's novel, the interlocking themes that emerge women's sufferings and women's struggle for emancipation and autonomy in patriarchal society and culture. The exploration of these novels lead us to the perspective which opened up by feminist discourse enabled me to discern the next of patriarchal control and its extraction of women's subservience. Desai's work does not rehearse traditional portrayals of the women, pleased to fulfill the roles of expected of them by patriarchy, both in the household and the public domain. Her female characters self-explain the state of oppression, suppression, and self-determination. In her novels, it was found that women are dislocated and displaced in the society. It was explored during this research paper that the women characters in her novels preferably try to escape from the undesirable experience they mostly encounter in the domestic sphere. In this piece of research work, wherein it was analyzed and in both the domestic spheres and in the public spheres, women are subject to varying degree of oppression and suppression. The final outcome of the novel leads me to the conclusion that these women characters struggle for independence. It is a worth mention, and most of them have experienced various degrees of self-determination, but they are also haunted by the past memories and are isolated from the community. Women characters reflected in the novels of Anita Desai are the real reflections of the true status of Indian women who are not able to achieve full liberation through their struggle against the dominant males in the patriarchal male chauvinism society. Thank you.
Nice presentation by Ms. Shazia. So any question to the presenter is most welcome.
And the immigrant. So is my PPT visible, ma'am?
Yes, it's visible. Yes.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. So my paper is on Manju Kapoor. Manju Kapoor was born in 1948 in Amritsar. She was graduated from Mirinda House College for Women. Now she has done MA from Dalhousie University, and she's a teacher of English literature at Mirinda House College. She has written many novels. Now, she is the women writer. Women writers has tried best to focus on various literary works through the centuries. In the modern age of change and development in every aspect, no one can deny the half of the population. The women writers of Indian English have tried best of non-attachment, and they begin to investigate and to acknowledge the position of women in male-dominated society and patriarchal issues that were present in the Indian society is undergoing drastic changes from time to time. There are lots of changes in Indian, from spiritual ascendancy to clashes in different religions, from dependence to independence, from farmland to the internet facility. In a modern feministic world, the concept of womanism and images is a very important issue for Indian women writers. It is obvious that women are exploited and subjugated on the basis of caste, class, creed, and social patriarchal setup. Indian women have been exploited and subjugated from ancient times to the modern era. The portrayal of an Indian woman in Indian English literary work as the victim who never make hue and cry, accepted old customs and traditions of their families and societies has undergone drastic change, and in modern era, they articulate about their subjugation and sexual assault. However, in every era, there is a protest against gender discrimination by various social reformers and activists. Manju Kapoor's representations of women as heroines in her works who do not want to be the silent and will bear each and everything by male-dominated society. Their patriarchal setup enforces them to be confined to their homes, but they affirm their personality, desires, and wishes through education. Manju Kapoor unravels the issues and highlights that are prevalent in Indian society from ancient civilization to understand how far and difficult it is for a woman to challenge this old tradition of patriarchal society and arrive at a state of peace and tranquility. She tried to present her own views regarding the evolution of new women in reality. Manju Kapoor's all novels have different themes, but deal with the typical middle class dreams, hopes, and aspirations. The background of these novels is urban in nature and catches the city life with ironical detachments. The various consequences of changing human relationships between men and women have been represented with detail and graphic observation in all her novels. She shows her deep insight in telling the tales of common people in daily life. There is a unique tone of experience in the so-called journey in this world. Traditions, conventions, and customs. All these things are linked with a unique sense of freedom, which has been recognized as the essence of modernity. According to K.K. Singh, quoted, compassion, sympathy, sacrifices, and cultural loads are linked with womanhood. Kapoor's unique sense of feminism in her novel is well displayed in an outstanding manner. She presents human beings in the context of conflict, especially family conflict, has been recognized as the core issue of her novels. In her all novels, Manju Kapoor seems to be always dealing with family as a central issue. Her novels are the tales of the people living in the family. Family teaches them to understand human essence of the continuity of human existence. Family is the source of developing strong relationships in the sense of devotion, mutual understandings, and respect to each other. The relationship mother and son, mother and daughter, father and daughter, mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, man and women, lover and beloved, can easily be noticed everywhere in her novels, right from the beginning to the last one. Manju Kapoor, in all her literary works, investigates the various problems faced by women within the Indian societies, which have been dominated by their male members. In her first novel, Difficult Daughters, present the narrative tale of the central character Veermati. She was not good dealing with her daughter in proper way, but Veermati has found it with new aspect to deal with the of education in choosing their life partner and economic independence. Veermati opposes the oppressions and symbolizes among the girls who want to choose what she wants in future. She didn't want to be treated like sex toys. In this way, we can say that Veermati as new women who want to be educated and wants to develop her life in a very good manner. Manju Kapoor stands as a voice of women through her feministic Her feministic writings present the character of Nina in the immigrant novel, who strives for her own liberation and attains a voyage of self-identity in the foreign country. Due to her experiences as an immigrant, Nina learns the fact that East and West have tremendous differences, which can't be equal. This fact ruins her dreams about a foreign country as well as married life. Manju Kapoor is a prolific writer from India. All her novels focuses on the life of a female characters. Her protagonists struggle for their individual identity in the patriarchal setup. Her novels reveals the lives of women, describing their struggle for basic rights, the quest for identity and survival. In the last novel, Custody, Manju Kapoor tries to present man, women, and husband-wife relationships in terms of legal aspects. To conclude, we can say that Manju Kapoor's womanly central characters are symbols of those female protagonists who desire to be free from the social patriarchy and customs. Her protagonists are highly educated, which leads them to be broad-minded and self-dependent, but their patriarchal society and family didn't allow them to do. It is their individual efforts and struggles with patriarchal customs and traditions of their family and society, through which the delicately themselves plunges in carve personal identity as qualified women with a poor and reckless background. Thank you.
Nice.
Topic is Shashi Deshpande's The Dark Horse of Gender Discrimination. And the points I will discuss here about the mantras, introduction, Deshpande's style of writing, Deshpande's feminism, Deshpande's journey towards womanhood, Deshpande's novel, A Plethora, then the novel, The Dark Horse No Terror, Deshpande's positivity, and conclusion. I'm starting with a common idea about the feminism. Pita rakshati kaumare, bharasta rakshati yavane, rakshati sthavire putra, srina satantra maryati. This idea has given a lot of times before by Manu Sanghita. We have taken this line from Manu Sanghita. That is, the role of women has been decided from a long decades ago. I'm starting with the introduction. Indian fiction in English visualizes a text of woman of the 20th century. It has been observed that a new trend of writing, the awakening of second sex in world literature, is liked by entire world. Somewhere it has been called feminism, somewhere it has referred as women issues. The different strata of life become the center of attraction in the novels of women worldwide. Whenever we are talking about the Shashi Deshpande, his little description is Shashi Deshpande is one of the most famous novelists, nailed her impression as a widely acclaimed novelist in this era. She neither believes in the concept that a woman character should go out of their way, shouting slogan, protesting and revolting against men, or nor blaming women as the sole cause of women's subordination and suffering. Her writing reflects delicate issues like marriage, gender disparities, and other various problems faced by women in a male-dominated society. The argument she raised is the empowerment of women, breaking out of joint families, the empowerment of suppressed and silent selection of the society. Deshpande depicts the unbearable pain of suppressed selection and the emergence of modern secular values such as egalitarianism. Whenever we're talking about the egalitarianism is the equal in the society, which is really we are not being able to see in our society basically. Then we're talking about the Deshpande's, how Deshpande's, what is the style of writing. Shashi Deshpande is the famous Indian woman novelist, projects in her writing about her lives and problems from a perspective of a woman. In her writing, she attempts to deconstruct man-made ideas, rules, and systems. Men of all ages consciously or unconsciously conspire to relegate and privilege at the center. She talks that she attempted to study the awareness of women's problems and predicaments, the uttered and the unuttered thoughts and feelings, their dilemmas, hopes, frustrations, suppressed desires, which are reflected in her novels. As a woman writer, she especially tries belongingness of the middle-class women who are bounded between the tight rope of tradition and modernity. Sometimes her ladies, her heroines are highly aware in different tradition, cultures, and modernity. As a result, sometimes they live in an ambivalent, that is the medieval situation in her mind, and the self-contradictory life. They are in a conflict and battle within that creates a lot of tension, confusion, and frustration that force them to live a life of suppression and alienation. Then Deshpande's feminism, whenever he's talking about the feminism, her feminism is completely different thing. Deshpande's heroines are well aware of the exploitations of women at various levels and the prevailing double standard social, moral, cultural, and religious codes that work against as a group. They strongly condemn the oppressive systems of patriarchy that binds them, curving their rights as an individual. From time immemorial, women have been denied the basic rights, sometimes even the right to exist. In her first novel, which is basically the topic of this presentation, The Darkhold No Terrors, where Sarita, she's a lady doctor, but she's also the victim of the unequal treatment of boys and girls at very early stage. She felt neglected when her mother showered all her love and attention upon her young brother Dhruv. Shashi Deshpande challenges the prevailing double standard code of conduct of the society that has different skills for women and men. For instance, when a married man keeps a mistress or has more than one wife, society accepts it as a normal thing. But the same society condemns the same thing if a woman does it. She tries to change the disparities of the society. Even in her religious book, Maintain Another Woman is not discarded by the society. Whatever I have told at the beginning of the book, that is about the Manu Sanhita, the part of the Manusmriti laid the foundation of such inequalities are observed. As a modern novelist, she protests these man-made concepts. Then whenever Deshpande starts his new journey, that is the journey towards her womanhood, Deshpande tries to explore the women characters in the novels against the socio-cultural context of Indian society. Her writings reflect various genuine problems overlooked as ordinary little things. Deshpande seems to present that seeming ordinary little things as the basic tools fashioned and designed by patriarchy in the name of culture, religion, tradition to assure male supremacy and women's subordination. She exposes that it is not only men, but also women who are responsible for the condition and their position in the society as a second sex. In a novel, Deshpande seems to reflect the struggles of women protagonists against such patriarchal systems. Her novels, basically her novels, a plethora, a dynamic change of life. As a creative writer, Deshpande doesn't create characters larger than life. Her women characters believe in presenting them as they are. In fact, they are ordinary women caught in certain situations that make view and review their past life. By doing so, perhaps the most important truth of their life is symbolized in their pains, sufferings, and frustrations. Jaya, in her another book, That Long Silence, Saru in The Darkhold No Terrors, and others have been blaming the society and the patriarchal cultures because all the years they internationalized the patriarchal norms and the so-called conditioned themselves. They have been so blinded to see that in this life, there are many crossroads, so many choices. Whenever we are discussing about the Darkhold No Terrors, she quotes about the Virginia Woolf. She told, imaginatively, she is the highest importance. Practically, she is completely insignificant. She pervades poetry from cover to cover. She is all but absent from history. She dominates the lives of kings and conquerors in fiction. But in fact, she was the slave boy whose parents forced a ring upon her finger. Some of the most inspired words, some of the most profound thoughts in literature fall from her lips. In real life, she could hardly read, could scarcely spell, and was the property of her husband. Deshpande concerns about her present position of the women in general and educated women in particular. She attempts to expose the root cause of women's problems and subordination. Through her novel, she is consciously trying to put women on center stage, pulling them out from the backstage where they had been pushed for many centuries. She tries to establish the dilemma of modern women who have been struggling and enduring all forms of inequalities and injustices right from the day when they born in total silence, much against their will. But Deshpande shows the light of wisdom whenever she expresses the positivity. She tries to point out the specific problems faced by the lower section of women who are not educated. Their sufferings is double as they are colonized twice because of their own sex, and secondly because of the class they belong to. Somewhere there are certain problems faced by certain women at a certain time that are purely personal and have nothing to do with problems faced by women in general. One of the problem actually she find out that Deshpande shows that this is the importance of economic emancipation, both positive and negative influences of financial independence in the power struggle within the family are taken into account with reference to the socio-cultural scenario of the society. In Western countries, the economic independence is often considered as the answer and the solution to the question of women's liberation from the dependence syndrome. In our society, economic independence works positively as a means towards women's emancipation in some cases, but the deeply rooted culture and tradition of Indian society overshadows the light of economic independence. Shashi Deshpande concerns about the conditions and the positions of women as reflected in her position of women as reflected in her novels. Somewhere her heroines are march past for financial liberty. On the other side, somewhere they are facing the identity crisis. But at the end, we can see that Shashi Deshpande wants to prove that in different segments of life, women are trying to fit them in different kinds of roles. Her concern shows about the conditions and position of a woman as reflected in her novels, being besides a daughter, a wife, a mother. According to the novelist, women should try to prove their worth in other arenas also. In an interview, Shashi Deshpande told that if half of the world's population remains in the shadow, behind the remaining half, the world's progress would retard by half. Women should not confine themselves playing the allotted roles and following are not superior or inferior to one another, but are different and should respect these differences in order to bring a harmonious and androgynous society. Her journey towards women empowerment is especially suited to Indian sensibility and favorable to Indian soil, though it has its universal appeal too. At the end, I will conclude my lines with the thoughts of T.S. Eliot from his the world-winning the Nobel Prize poem, The Wasteland. Datta Dadham Damayat. Give, be compassionate and self-control. Shashi Deshpande ultimately expresses these thoughts with her writing. Thank you.
And the title of my thesis is Communication Gap. It is implication in Half Girlfriend, and the novel is written by Chetan Bhagat. And I am Javed Ahmed Tatre, lecturer, Government Boys Higher Secondary School, Tad Karna. And this is the title, and the objective of my thesis is to analyze communication. What does the communication mean, and how much the role of communication is in our day-to-day activities of life. Then I have to observe socio-cultural problems for our effective communication and what are the hurdles, whether they are social hurdles or cultural hurdles that come across in our communication process. So finally, I have to look into the implication of this communication gap in the novel, that is Half Girlfriend. And this novel is written by Chetan Bhagat. And I'm going to explore this communication gap theme that has been very much predominant in this novel. So if we talk about India, India is a multicultural country, and here we can see a number of cultures, number of regions where people do speak different kinds of languages. And every region has its own mother tongue, and the people most in these areas, they communicate in these languages as well. And then if we see the population of India, that is 1.3 billion population, more than that. And we see in India, more than 600 languages are spoken throughout India. But if we talk about English language, English is not the mother tongue of India, and it is a secondary language, and it is non-native language of India, and people do speak here English as a secondary language. So if we talk about English, role of English in India, it is very much, and it is very, we can say English is an international language. its impact, its role is very much throughout the world, because this language, it is, I think, the common mode of expression through which people throughout the world, they are able to communicate with each other as well. So if we talk about this English in our higher education, mostly if we talk about the medium of instruction that we use in our higher education, that is English, and English is mainly used there as a method of teaching. Yeah, we can also say that is also used there as a way of communication, because India, we can say the people, yeah, we can say students studying in these institutions, they come from different backgrounds, they come from different languages, they are not able to communicate in their regional languages there. That is why English language there plays an important role, and it becomes a kind of bridge among all these students who are studying in these higher institutions as well. So I see that how this communication gap is mostly seen in our Indian education system. Yeah, we can also say in these Indian higher education, in our universities, and most of the students, they have this communication gap. They are not very much comfortable in this English language. That is why Chetan Bhagat in this novel that is called Half Girlfriend, and Half Girlfriend also highlights this theme, that is communication gap, and how much it is dominant in our these universities, and how Chetan Bhagat he tries to portray this theme in this novel as well. So when we look upon this novel, the important character of this novel, that is that is Madhav. And in this novel, Chetan Bhagat tries to show that how Madhav, actually he was from Bihar, his language was Hindi, and when he comes to Delhi for study, he faces this communication problem. And Chetan Bhagat through this novel tries to show how this communication gap plays an important role in these higher institutions, especially among those candidates who are coming from rural background. So when we look at this novel, the setting of this novel, it has setting in rural Bihar, it has setting in Delhi, Patna, New York. So the important character, that is Madhav, and another important character, that is Riya. Madhav was from Bihar and he was from rural area, and Riya, she is from Delhi, and she is we can say she is from Delhi, she is from metropolitan culture, and she was having very much access with English language, and she was very, very comfortable in English language as well. So mostly through this novel, Chetan Bhagat tries to show that how this Madhav, because he was from Bihar, he was from rural background, he was having problem in speaking in English, he was not very much comfortable in English, and throughout this novel, Madhav struggles and he feels helplessness when he comes in this kind of culture where the language of English, it is having dominant role. So first of all, when he comes to the college for the interview, and he has to take the admission in the college, and the name of the college, that was St. Stephen's College of Delhi, and that is a Christian missionary college, and the medium of instruction in the college, that was English, because we can say the culture of that college, that was also Western. So we can say the English language, that was the only means of communication that was very much predominant there in the college. So when he comes for the interview for admission, so when he comes before the professors, he tries to speak in English, and he didn't feel comfortable on that time. And he was very much embarrassed when he started speaking English, and the professors there, they started mocking him. And after that, he decided that he should speak in Hindi because he felt himself comfortable in Hindi language. So when he moves ahead, then he faces again the problem among the students, among his, we can say, batchmates, because most of his batchmates, they were from Delhi, they were from urban background, and they were very much comfortable with this language. And in this way, he was not only facing a problem of speaking before the professors as well, he was having this problem of communication gap with his batchmates as well. Then he also faces very much uncomfortableness in the company of Riya, because Riya was very much fluent in English. When he comes across in her company, he develops friendship with her, and she was very much fluent when she started speaking English. And he, on that time, most of the time, he feels very much embarrassed. Then what happens? With the passage of time, he develops friendship with Riya, and what happens that then they were separated, both of them. Actually, we can say Madhav, he was a traditional type of person. He wants to become very close to Ria, because Ria's personality, her way of thinking, that was modern type of, we can say that was modern, Western, and she didn't feel very much comfortable then in the company of Madhav, and both of them, they are separated. And after that, we can say, then he spent some time in Delhi. And after that, he didn't feel very much comfortable in Delhi. He decides to go back to his own state, and he goes to Bihar, and he wants to spend some time in the school that was the school of his mother. And after that, what happens? He once meets the MLA, and he wants to get the donation for the school. And the MLA didn't help him for the school. And after that, he provided him an information about the arrival of Bill Gates Foundation. And what Bill Gates Foundation used to do, they usually visit these schools and help these schools to build the infrastructure in these schools as well. But for that, again, he faces a problem. Actually, on the day when the foundation has to visit to his school, he has to prepare a speech in English. So again, he faces this communication gap. Because he wasn't comfortable in English, then he decides to learn English. And after that, he goes to Patna, where he takes spoken English classes, so that he will feel comfortable, so that he will learn this language of English, so that he will speak this English language. And what happens then? Fortunately, he meets Ria again there, and Ria helps him in learning English. And in this way, he prepares a speech in English. And when the day comes for Bill Gates Foundation, when that day comes, and on that day, he presents a speech in English. And his speech was very much impressive. And he was able to remove that gap which he was feeling when he came to join the college. And after that, when he again, we can say through his life, he faces this communication gap. But we can say through his hardship, through his struggle, he comes across, he conquers this communication gap. And finally, we can say with his hardships and his perseverance, he gets success in removing this communication gap, which he faced most of his time in his life. So we can say in the conclusion, I will say here, so finally, Chetan Bhagat, throughout this novel, he tries to show that how the language, English language, it is playing an important role in India, and how much it is, this language is very much important in our higher institutions of India, and how this Bhagat, this Madhav, the important character of this novel, how he was having this problem, how he was facing this communication gap when he came to these institutions, where he faces this kind of problem. So we can say this novel is truly, it is a reflection of that. It truly reflects the communication gap that we witness in the character of Madhav throughout this novel. Thank you.
Pandita and Barshat Peer's novels, both of them, they are dealing with times which are gone by, that is 1990s. But that is when the trouble started in Kashmir. And since then, it has been almost 30 years, and this spiral of violence continues. But what we have lost is not only lives, not only so many things, but also the trauma, and especially the childhood of the children. Now, many of us can relate to the problems that children are facing in the COVID situation, where they are confined to their homes, not going to schools, not going to their playgrounds, and the kind of mental problems that we are facing with our children. But we need to think about these war-torn countries, war-torn states, where this kind of violence and trauma has been continuing for the last so many years. So basically, I'm going to talk about that trauma. And when we talk of Kashmir, Emperor Jahangir's statement, where he says that if there is a paradise on earth, it is this, it is this, it is this, that comes to mind. But Kashmir has been a very unique place because of the various religions, because of the various emperors and empires that have ruled over it. And the time period that I have taken is since 1990s. And according to 2015 data, so many people have lost their lives, so many people have been reported missing. But in all those data that we are getting, the most problematic part is the children of the valley. They are facing so much depression, repression, stress, trauma, post-trauma, and it is basically due to the loss of their security, their income, the migrations, the disturbed school life, the harassments, and so many other issues which they have to face. Trauma, as we see, it's an event that fragments the consciousness and prevents direct linguistic representation. Even the great psychologist Freud says that trauma is the representation of the soul whose mind is disarranged and muddled up with evocative images or events, which is terrifying or unresolved from his past. So trauma fiction has become a major sort of study in recent times, especially in the 20th century. And it is because of so much neurosis and other psychological complexities which are attached to it. In a report that was published a few years back, they claim that 37% of the orphans lost one or two of their parents due to this conflict. And many of them, they were orphaned due to natural, but others also due to different other reasons. Similarly, the post-traumatic conditions where 30 to 50% of the victims are suffering from this post-trauma status. Along with that, so many people are facing other mental disorders which have been reported and which is causing so much of trauma among the children of the particular place. And these kind of trauma experiences are fictionalized in literature, but mainly from the adult way of life. The children are left out. So these two writers, that is Bashrat Peer and Rahul Pandita, they spent their childhood in Kashmir. And during those days, when they were children, they saw one of the darkest periods of Kashmir history. So that dark period has been the migration of the Kashmiri Pandits and the kind of treatment which the Kashmiri Muslims had to face. And because this kind of trauma is basically seen from the adult life, the kind of situation faced by the children is generally left out. So every Kashmiri or every Kashmiri person, he has suffered from the gunfires, the crackdowns, the massacres, and so many other violent things. And I here take two quotes from both the writers. And in both of them, if we read them, we find that they are talking about the trauma of childhood, which they experienced as a young child at a very young age. Both Peer as well as Pandita, they suffered from this kind of trauma and post-trauma situation. So many instances where these war-torn societies face these traumatic conditions, but because of the bloodshed, because of the political seesawing, these things are left out. Nobody talks about them. Nobody gives them any kind of recognition, which I think is very unfortunate. So the only way by which this thing can be brought back is through Kashmir's very old tradition of Kashmiriyat, the composite culture, the spirit of respect for one another, the festivals, the together which they celebrated, the rituals, traditions. So Kashmiriyat is for peace and tolerance among various communities. And I think this is where all the people in the name of children should go back to this kind of Kashmiriyat, because only then we will see some kind of respite from this violence and trauma. And I end my presentation with these lines from Dinanath Nadeem, his poem, My Hope of Tomorrow. I dream of tomorrow when the world will be beautiful. Oh, how bright the day, how green the grass, flowers paradisal, earth aching with joy, and dancing fountains of love in his breast. The world will be beautiful. So this is the general picture of Kashmir, which we hope to see in the future. Thank you very much. These are the references.
Thank you so much, sir, for that very enlightening video that definitely does represent the, the sensitive aspects that are often ignored.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, moving on with the presentations. Now we move on to the next speaker. And the next speaker is, excuse me for a minute. Can we have the,
for providing me this opportunity to present my paper. The name of the topic of my paper is Towards a New Humanistic Paradigm, a Post-Colonial Study of Richard Flaggen's Novel. I'm Pooja Kumari, a PhD research scholar from Lovely Professional University. I have made a study of Richard Flaggen's novel, and Richard Flaggen is an Australian novelist who writes about Australian colonization. And the main feature of his colonization is Tasmanian colonization. Richard Flaggen is a well-known writer who has established himself as an Australian writer of international repute. He has got the Man Booker Prize. Am I visible? Man Booker Prize in 2014.
Yes.
2014 for Narrow Road to the Narrow Road to the Deep North. Here I will discuss the discourse of colonization in his novels. The theoretical framework I have used for this paper is Edward Said's Orientalism and inter-imperiality, the theory which is given by Laura Doyle. Both theories deals with the post-colonial theme. Tasmanian colonization, I have mentioned, as I have mentioned earlier, the Tasmanian colonization is the main feature of Richard Flaggen's novels. Tasmania is an island which is located in Australia. It's 150 miles to the south of the Australian mainland. It's an island, and here the Aboriginals live. British ruled there around 18th century to 19th century, and the Aboriginals faced a lot of problems due to colonization over here. The thing we found in Flaggen's novel is that here we see the brutalities of East on East by the West people, and also the identity construction. I have used two theories here. Aboriginals were forced by then Governor George Augustin Robinson to move Flinders Island. It was an island where the people were used to kept as prisoners from the British land, and slowly and gradually it became their permanent settlement, and the whole Aboriginal society were most of the Aboriginal society were wiped out from there. The act of genocide and massive ethnic cleansing in the remote island of Tasmania is still least explored. When we talk about colonization, mostly we read about Asian colonization, but Australian colonization, but hardly people talk about Tasmanian colonization. It's a great Australian silence tale. Tom Lawson and Lyndon Wren talks about it. The dearth of literature on this episode of British colonization is crystal clear. Richard Flaggen is a writer who talks about Tasmanian colonization in his works. Except The Unknown Terrorist and the first person, all his novels deals with this theme. The uniqueness of all these themes and frames is that sometimes they agree that Orientalism feature rules according to the colonization, the theme of colonization, but most of the time it also shows the impact of inter-imperiality. Although most of these theoretical framework almost have contradictory assumptions and starting point, Richard Flaggen has skillfully managed to deal with both of the themes in his works. Post-colonial theory, Edward Said's Orientalism, and Laura Doyle's inter-imperiality. When we talk about the traces of colonialism, we go back to 14th and 15th century, when Britishers started to explore other countries for establishing their industries. Gradually, they started to interfere politically also in the colonized countries. Despite of many reasons, it was major driving force behind the philosophy of colonialism that they wanted to rule over the world. They wanted to develop people according to their theories which they made about others. They wanted to make others civilized because they believed that they were superior to other races. And when we talk about post-colonial, so post-colonial is a rigorous academic endeavor to investigate the impact of colonialism and imperialism across the globe. It traces historical, social, economic, philosophical, and cultural legacy of colonialism at various geographical sites of the world. The theoretical standpoints of Edward Orientalism helps here to analyze nature and quality of two major types of Richard Flaggen's discourse. First, its identity construction. First, its West brutality on the East. How West people, how the Occidental people ruled over Oriental people. And second is the identity construction. West people made an identity about the East people that they consider them uncivilized, barbaric, and irrational. They consider them weaker ones. Though various characters in the novel, Richard Flaggen's novels, British biased understanding regarding indigenous aboriginals of Tasmania. On the other hand, when we talk about Laura Doyle's theory, interimperiality, which is named as interimperiality, in her paper, The Long Dialectic of Power and Culture, she has given a seminal contribution about this post-colonial theory. Her theory stands in complete contrast with Sed's Orientalism. She says that the flow of the power is not unidirectional. It is dynamic. She challenges the simplified binary of West and East, which was central to Sed's theoretical understanding. She argues that instead of understanding 18th century European colonization and the enforcement of law from West to East as an isolated event, it must be understood in the larger context of the transcontinental interactions of political and economic field of several empires operating simultaneously in ancient and medieval periods and their relation to capital formation. The first impact in understanding European colonization in such broader perspective of interimperiality will be on concept of power, that is called fluid positionality. It blurs the clear boundary between the oppressors and the oppressed. She says we have found many instances when oppressor becomes the oppressed and the oppressed becomes the oppressors also. The cross-cultural and continental movement of narratives and characters and its importance, relevance in large discourse of Flaggen's discourse of colonialism has been reflected here in the novels of The Narrow Road to the Deep North, The Sound of One Hand Clapping, and that of The River Guide. When we consider Flaggen's first novel, that of The River Guide, there is a character, Alsace Cozzini, who is a reflection of Orientalism and interimperiality as well. The author narrates the story of the river guide who is unfortunate and trapped somewhere in the rocks underneath. When the story starts, he is in a dying stage and he recollects his past, and which reflects the theories of interimperiality and Orientalism. It shows how the oppressor of the past has become the oppressed in present. This is a perfect trope of interimperiality as well as Orientalism, which Flaggen has employed in his novels. Next is there is Booker Prize winning novel, The Narrow Road to the Deep North. Here, the Dorigo Evans is a character who is from Japan, and he is in Pao camp. Society considers him as a hero for surviving in war, but in actual he knows that he is not a hero at all. He is in dilemma. As story open, we realize that Ivan has been grappling with a mental dilemma. He considers himself morally bad, a person, but is considered as a hero by society. The explicit theme is of negative consequences of war here. Although post-war Australian society respects Dorivo a lot, but he has no respect for himself. He considers himself a morally bad person. Here, here again, we subvert the clear-cut boundary of the West and the absolute oppressor and East as absolute oppressed as envisaged by Orientalism. Again, the novel Gold Book of Fish. Gold Book of Fish is a reflection of such Orientalism. The main character of the story is William Bullock Gould. This is the story of self-discovery of his main character. As story begins, we come to know that Gould is very unfortunate and he has faced many problems in his life and he faces extreme poverty also. But because of lack of food availability, he is physically weak and is not capable of doing heavy physical work. Flaggen designs the story of his character in such a way that for reader, it becomes a constant reminder of European colonization of Tasmania and the brutal annihilation of indigenous aboriginals, and hence employing one of the strongest themes of Orientalism. Then there is another novel, Wanting, written by Flaggen, which is a clear reflection of colonization, Orientalism, and interimperiality. There's the character Methina. She's Aboriginal girl, and she is being exploited by the Britishers, and it's an example of Orientalism. On the other hand, she constructs an identity of West people as brutal in her mind. So here we say we see that there is a unique, not unidirectional concept that is being constructed by the characters. It's a dynamic construction of identity, which is Methina constructing from her side in her mind, and on the other hand, Britishers which have constructed an identity of Aboriginals in their mind. Simultaneously with the above story, Flaggen narrates the story of a girl, Methina. While narrating, Flaggen employs various frameworks of Orientalism and mainly of identity construction of East by West. So Flaggen has also employed this powerful framework to Orientalism while narrating the horror of British colonization through his characters. This novel is the clear depiction of social, political, economic, cultural, and psychological damage done by European colonial masters to the Tasmanian indigenous people. Conclusion: thus, the presented paper provides increased knowledge about Tasmanian discourse of colonization in literary aspect as well as societal level. The study can be starting point in the finding the scope of implementing the post-colonial literary theory in the works of fiction related to Aboriginality. It also facilitates the further studies based on the post-colonial literary theory. These are the works which I have cited, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ms. Pooja. That was indeed a very interesting Australian literature. So thank you. That was very enlightening. Thank you. All right, moving on with the next person for the presentation. We have now, the next presentation is by me. I'm Dr. Karishma Bisht, and I am an assistant professor at Isabella Thoburn College, Lucknow. So without further ado, let me quickly share my screen with all of you. All right. I hope the screen is visible to all of you present there.
Yes.
All right. So, all right. So the topic of my presentation is Kalidasa, the maestro of sublime in, all right, Kalidasa, the maestro of sublime in his work, Shakuntala. When we often talk about writers who are considered as maestro, as in very superior in terms of representing their aesthetic talents, how they write, we often try to compare them with writers who have written in the past, or maybe who have written just as superior as them. And in this account, I feel the writers with whom Kalidasa is often being compared to are writers, pioneer writers, like in the Greek tradition, we have Homer, and in the Western canon, we have writers like William Shakespeare, who are known for their expression, who are known for their vitality and the way in which they are really able to reflect the society just the way it is. And that is the reason why he comes under that literary canon, where everything what he is representing, people definitely find it relevant even today. So to bridge a little interesting insight in context to the similarities that these writers have in common, the first thing that they have is that they are reflecting the society, which is the reason why they were very popular during their time. And you could notice that in the social beliefs, the traditions that they were representing in their work. All this was definitely trying to show, or was implying in a way, that they were popular and they were earning very well in the literary field. The second aspect is their expression. This is like just reflecting the society is not enough. You go watch a movie, the movie has to, in a way, captivate you. And that is what their work did. The expression, the dialogues, everything was completely riveting for the audiences. And that is the reason why people were very spellbound by the way in which the character would express itself in their work. So there is also another facet that I feel that is common in all of them. They're all wearing masks. We are in the COVID atmosphere just now. So their mask, just like a mask helps you to protect yourself from the COVID virus, for them, the mask was actually a defense in which they were not really allowing people to know a little bit more about them. So there is not much biographical information that is available in context to their education, the sources that they were doing. Like, there are critical works going on. There is a lot of profound research done, but we do not have complete biographical account of these stalwarts. Like, nobody knows from where did Homer come from? What was Kalidasa really doing at his time? Even his period is not really defined if you look at the chronology in which this writer belongs to. So that's a very interesting facet about them. And when such things happen, when you have a mask in which you're not letting your identity be disclosed about your personal life, what really happens is that the flavor that you have to get out of the work that the writer is presenting is just the work in itself. So that is what is going to give you the right brewed coffee. And you find it very interesting because that is what the only thing at focus is when you're looking at their work. So the main aim of my paper is mainly to identify these critical creative techniques that a writer is using in order to bring the sublime influence. That is the influence that is mainly keeping you spellbound. What is the thing that is making a work superior? That is what my main concern is in this particular work. So the major theme that is there in this work is that it is a love story of two lovers, one coming from a very affluent family, he's a king, and the other coming from a very humble background. And the story is mainly talking about initial union where they're loving each other mainly for their true emotional sentiments. There is no such assumption really taken on basis of caste or their community. They're just loving each other mainly for their true self. But sadly, in the story, there is a bleak time when they're having a kind of separation. And eventually in the story, you notice that the story actually ends on a happy note, that is representing the reunion. So in this structure, what you notice is very important is the very idea of how the writer represents the aspect of reunion in the end. This itself is showing you like the very idea of that reunion here represents and helps us to understand that the very theme of this play is all about representing true emotions and sentiments for the person. So when two lovers share that very emotional, true honesty and sentiments for each other, the union should always be successful. Which is why the writers and even the audiences back at that time were very profoundly influenced by this work, which is something that you don't usually notice in love stories, that they do not in real life end up with a happy union, but this definitely does happen here. And this reunion in the structure is suggestive of that idea. There are other things that I've discussed, but I will not be discussing it in this PowerPoint presentation. Moving on to the second feature, which is the language. Now, there are a lot of aspects of language that a writer really wants to represent when he is discussing and expressing the character, when the character is expressing. And one of the things that I have discussed here is the aspect of symbolism. Symbolism is very important, and usually stalwarts like William Shakespeare or Kalidas or Homer, they are very, very intrigued by this very tool that is symbolism, because symbolism allows you a scope for interpretation. There is a lot you can project in the very idea that the object represents, which is why it is considered to be a very important, significant element for a writer. In this work in particularly, the ring is the most important element or symbol that has often been discussed in multiple papers. Initially, if you have to talk about the symbol, is definitely representing the true approval of the bond between the lovers, which is why the king presents this ring to his beloved, Shakuntala, because he has profound love for her, true love for her. But eventually what you notice is that the ring is eventually, as the story moves on, this story becomes the bad guy and actually results in the conflict between the lovers, because that is actually what is causing the separation between the lovers in the due course of the story. And this is mainly because Rishi Muni curses Shakuntala for being lost and pensive on the thoughts of this very dynamic man, this king. And the curse that he gives is that the person you're thinking will not remember you. So, and the only solution to this loss of memory that the king is experiencing is that ring. So if the king gets to see the ring, then he can probably, the union can happen. But unfortunately, the ring is lost in a river, so nobody can account for that. And that is what actually results in a lot of conflict, which is the reason why there are many papers. One of the papers that I'm showing to you people on the slide in front of you is where the ring has been described as the curse motive in this particular play. That is what is providing you the psychological insight. So in this way, you notice how this very symbol is acting as, is definitely profoundly available with multiple interpretation. And it is focally representing the idea of memory, where the king cannot remember anything about Shakuntala, even though he shares true emotions and feelings for her. The most important facet about this ring that Kalidasa is in a way suggestively trying to show through this ring is that the ring also represents an aspect of cultural acknowledgement. So when you put on the ring, it is a sign that, yes, this is the lady that I'm going to be with, and that the society is approving of it, which is the reason why the person has gifted the ring to Shakuntala. But that is not possible. So the third most important facet that the writer uses in his work is the very essence of emotions. This is where you notice that the dominant emotion in this particular play is the aspect of love. And the lovers are really able to unite together. They are able to blossom and flower their relationship very well, because eventually in the end, the characters trust their instincts. And that is something that is really required. In matters pertaining to the heart, it is very important for you to follow the instincts of your inner self, then to follow your reason. And that is exactly what the character here also does. The characters give profound importance to their instincts, which is what results in the manifestation of a positive reunion. And so in this way, you notice that this play definitely does represent a successful impact even today for the audience. The fact that this was actually written in Sanskrit, but now, even after the translation, it is so popular and well known. And people love it because of this truth and honesty that is represented through this emotion. So that's my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. All right.
My abstract, this paper tries to give insight into, literature. if we try to trace the origin of children's literature, we go back to the ages where the oral stories were passed on from generation to generation. Juvenile literature was intended to give moral education to children. The function of this literature was to bring a discipline among children or to entertain the children. Initially, this literature was meant for children and adults also. It is the special branch of study now purely for children only. It is the picture, it is in the picture form, in caricature, 3D, visual graphics available. It is any literature which is enjoyed by the children. Children's literature is intended now for both adults and for children as well. The great Indian Puranas, Ramayana and the Mahabharatas are of adults as well as for children. It teaches how an ideal king should be. It teaches responsibilities and duties. Children's literature is for teaching children. This literature brings about all-round development among children. It enables them to read, write, and speak. This literature helps them to inculcate values. It helps them in their formative years. In modern time, the concept about children's literature has changed. Now, it is also important for all age groups. Juvenile literature includes lullabies, rhymes, songs, stories, novels, dramas, and prose. We have various writers that have developed children's literature. That is one of them is Ruskin Bond, writes in multiple genres and is best known for his short stories for children. Ruskin Bond has aptly said, I quote, writing for children is an art in itself and a most interesting one, unquote. He has written more than 500 stories in his short story. The Thief is about a 15-year-old thief. A narrator of the story happens to meet a man named Arun at a wrestling match. He starts living at Arun's place, cooking and working for him. And Arun, in return, teaches him how to read and write. One day, he robs Arun and tries to run away. But his conscience brings him back to the house. It is a story about trust, forgiveness, and teaches us that love, kindness have the power to change people and things around us. This story gives a lesson of honesty, love, and care. In this way, the function of the children's literature is to change the mind of the people, the mind of the children, to inculcate the values of honesty, love, and care for each other. Another story by Ruskin Bond that is Dust on the Mountain is about Vishnu, a simple village boy, goes from town to town to earn a living and support his family. He goes on to make some good friends along the way, but he has to face harsh realities. He has to face harsh realities of life. The story, like Bond's most stories, teaches readers how important is it to take care of nature. He also highlights the loneliness that children experience when they are away from their loved ones and natural surroundings. Ruskin Bond's stories teaches care, honesty, love, affection, moral, and love for nature through his literary works. Another novelist that is well known, that is J.K. Rowling. J.K. Rowling transports us to the world of magic and science. J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter is a series of 7 fantasy novels. It depicts the chronicle lives of young wizard Harry Potter, who is a central character in the series, lives in a fictional town Little Winging Surrey with his aunt, uncle, and cousin. He discovers at the age of 11 that he is a wizard. He lives in the ordinary world of non-magical people known as Muggle world, albeit hidden and secret. His magical qualities are inborn, and his friends, Gregor and Wesley, they were the students at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. The main story concerns Harry's struggle against Lord Voldemort, a dark wizard who intends to become immortal, overthrew the wizard governing body known as the Ministry of Magic and subjugate all the wizards and Muggles, non-magical people. In this way, it fascinates the children. It is interesting for children. Another that is well famous, that is Rudyard Kipling. born on December 30, 1865 in Bombay in India. Rudyard Kipling, journalist, short story writer, poet, novelist, was born in India, Bombay, now in Mumbai. His stay in India gave background to many of his works. He was keenly observant of the thronging spectacle of native India. Many have also criticized that he has written about colonial India and he has glorified in his novels colonial India. He celebrates colonialism in India, and he considers, many critics consider that he is glorifying colonialism in India and celebrating imperialism, and considers Indians as they are backward. And we also get this in his Jungle Book that was published in 1894. Even though it can be seen critically and from the point of view of children as well. One of many fictional works include his famous collection of stories, that is the Jungle Book, 1894. The setting is Indian jungle, Seoni, the central state of Madhya Pradesh. In his book, Mowgli, the central character, is brought up by the pack of wolves. Sher Khan, a tiger, antagonist, is enemy of Mowgli, threatens to kill him. Other characters such as Wolf, Akela, a panther, Bagheera, Bengal log, a tribe of monkeys, python, that's Ka, and a bear, that is Baloo. All these are very fascinating to children. It teaches about law and freedom. Even though this story is intended for children, even though they are in jungle, even the animal, it teaches about the respect, authority, law, order, obedience, and discipline. All this we come to know from the stories that are meant for children. Charles Ludwig Dodson, better known for his pen name, that is Lewis Carroll, was an English writer of children's fiction, better known for his novel Alice's Adventure in Wonderland, 1865, and its sequel Through the Looking Glass. He is a renowned Victorian author. He is also known for his comic fantasies and humorous childlike works. Alice's Adventure in Wonderland centers on Alice, a young girl who falls asleep in a meadow and dreams that she follows White Rabbit down a rabbit hole. She experiences many wondrous, often bizarre adventures with illogical and strange characters. They often change the size unexpectedly. Sometimes she grows as tall as a house and shrinks as small as 3 inches. She encounters the hookah smoking caterpillar, the Duchess with the baby that becomes a pig, and the Cheshire cat. She attends a strange endless tea party with Mr. Mad Hatter and the March Hare. She plays a game of croquet with the unmanageable flamingo for croquet mallet and uncooperative hedgehogs for the croquet false, while the queen calls for the execution of almost everyone present. Later, at the queen's behest, the Griffon takes Alice to meet the sobbing mock turtle, who describes his education in such subjects as ambition, distraction, uglification, and derision. Alice is then called as a witness in the trial of the Knave of Hearts, who is accused of having stolen the queen's tarts. However, when the queen demands that Alice be beheaded, Alice then awakens from her dream. So in this way, these stories pass a different world. They are known that there is some courts and there's trial. In this way, we can develop, they can also read.
The biographical Pandita Ramabai. Pandita Ramabai is a social reformer, 19th century social reformer who worked for the betterment of women of her time. So I've titled my paper as Reading Pandita Ramabai Through the Lines of Meera Kusumbis, Pandita Ramabai, life and landmark sociologist, academician, and historian, is highly famed for her life sketches on the major social reformers of 19th and 20th century Maharashtra. Her interest in gender issues, which sprang in her by the later part of her career, took her to the exploration of the lives of the Maharashtrian women social reformers like Pandita Ramabai, Kashibai Kanetkar, and Prema Kantak. Kosambi's diverse contributions span across areas of feminism, social, Marathi fiction by women authors, gender, culture, Marathi theatre, cinema, and much more. Kosambi's life narrative on Pandita Ramabai, titled Pandita Ramabai, Life and Landmark Writings, gained her much critical acclaim, though posthumously. Kosambi's is a unique record within her liminal social milieu and discursive networks is encountered in the various phases of her life. Kosambi traces her diverse ideological roots, reading along the lines of Ramabai's reformative writings. Kosambi here traces the reformative trajectory of Ramabai, positioning her within the women hostile socio-cultural and ideological scape of 19th century India as a high caste Hindu woman and her successive travels abroad, preaching, critical writings, and a religious conversion. Some of Ramabai's writings are retrieved, translated, and included in the work like High Caste Hindu Woman and Voyage to England, along with Kosambi's analysis. I think I'm audible. Am I audible?
Yes, please continue.
Excuse me? Okay. So Kosambi begins her endeavor with a reference to the publishing of Ramabai's The High Caste Hindu Woman in the United States by 1987 by Rachel Botley. So Botley in her introduction to the account stated, the silence of 1,000 years is broken. So Kosambi exalts this work as an unofficial Indian feminist manifesto. And she says, which has indeed broken the 1,000 years long silence of trauma and turmoil the upper caste Hindu women had been living through. So exposing the feigning dogmatizing of Manu, the author of Manu Smriti, and the treacherous manipulating of the Vedas by the spiritual fathers of religion and custom, misreading and misrepresenting it with its demeaning stance on womanhood. Ramabai expresses contempt for having been ruled under Queen Victoria, the most powerful woman ruler of the British Empire. We are here talking about the 19th century India. So Ramabai's account seems to be a desperate plea towards the British authority to rescue her hapless sisters from her own countrymen. So Ramabai's account seems to be an explicit document on the double oppression women underwent during the colonial era. So Ramabai ends her account with a note suggesting some emancipatory methods for the high caste Hindu women and child widows, which may help them live their lives independently and with dignity. So her suggestions for setting up houses for widows with amenities like libraries, where they can learn, teach, and could be taught craft, art, religion, and literature are reformative in a time when women holding or even touching a pen or book was prohibited by customary laws. So as Kosambi knows, Ramabai's tireless voice for the women of her clan never interested the conservatism of her homeland, though the West hailed it to celebrate. So quoting from Madhav's Pandita Ramabai, 1970, Kosambi writes, she was a unique and extraordinary person, and Maharashtrian society, having yet to produce an individual of her stature engaged in gender-related reform on such a vast and variegated scale, still remains unwilling to remember her and unable to forget. The Meera Kosambi states her onset as a retrieval of the real Ramabai, her significant text, her multiple ideological evolutions, and her feminism, striving within the intersecting and conflicting structures of patriarchy, religion, nationalism, and internationalism, developing her own eclectic idiom. Kosambi disavows the binary perceptions of either positioning the Pandita as an unwavering feminist or as a proselytized Christian, as faltering in identifying the ideological evolution of Pandita Ramabai. Kosambi holds a vantage point that Ramabai was a site for a series of overlapping encounters, primarily between Hinduism and Christianity, rationalism and dogma, individuality and church hierarchy, surrounded by the larger confrontation between Indianness and Western culture, feminism and patriarchy in its multiple guises. Kosambi also attempts to document the most neglected period in Ramabai's life, 1883 to 88, which Kosambi identifies as a glaring void in most of her Indian biographies. Kosambi also finds Ramabai's proselytization as a main reason behind the absence of Ramabai in most of the official and historical documents on Reformation, so attempting to fill the gap media Kosambi traces and documents until it ends in the last chapter, Mukti. So Ramabai was born on 23rd April 58 in the surroundings of Gangamul, South Karnataka. Kosambi finds the genealogy of Ramabai's reformative spur in the educationist father of Ramabai, Ananda Shastri Dogre. Ananda Shastri started his initiative first by educating his first wife and later, post death, extending to his second wife, whom he received as a little 9-year-old girl. Shastri's move to educate women shocked the religiosity of the community. It's uncustomary and shocking and could only be received with furor and ostracizing. However, as Ramabai documents, the learned Shastri scholastically outed the communal angst, validating his stance on women's education with supporting Sanskrit slokas and verses from the religious text. It's worth noticing that Shastri, however, maintained the Vedas is reserved from the reach of women and Shudras, although Ramabai could access it later in her life. And later, when Ramabai's reading of the Vedas exposed to her that many words from the Vedas had been dangerously misread, misrepresented, and wrongly exercised as a legitimate customary known to the Hindus. Ramabai holds the priestly translators of the Vedas and the misogynistic spiritual fathers of the custom, with special emphasis on Manu as a root responsible for the manipulations and the subsequent oppression of women. So Ramabai's constant stop of Sharada Sadan in Mumbai and Mukti Mission in Pune. So I skip most of these. And Ramabai's mastery over the Sanskrit language and mythological text conferred on her the title of Pandita and Saraswati. So in Calcutta or Kolkata, Brahma Samaj inducted her into the reform circle to champion the cause of women's education, for which she lectured widely within the Bengal presidency. Ramabai's fame soon crossed boundaries, as the gist of one of her lectures at Banaras reached Dr. W.W. Hunter, the chairman of Hunter Commission of Education in 1882. Despite her unique scholasticism, Ramabai's strong inclination towards belief in the customary norms as legitimate standards can be seen surfacing in her emphasis on the need for women's knowledge of Dharma and Niti, as exemplified in her first Marathi book, Sri Dharma Niti. So I skip all of that. And the shift from a Brahmanical orthodoxy first took its explicit form with her marriage to the non-Brahmin Bengali lawyer Bipin Behari Das Medhavi. And her interest in Christianity first began with a meeting of a missionary, Mr. Allen. And later, after the death of Medhavi, she joined Pradhana Samaj with the mission of women's education under Justice Ranade. So Kosambi's agenda in Life and Landmark writings seemed to be to evoke the explicit absence of Ramabai's presence in the Maharashtrian psyche. The analysis of the male obituaries on Ramabai that Kosambi performs in the last chapter seemed to be an exposing of the patriarchal self of the male reformers who hail themselves as the tireless reformers striving for the betterment of women. Kosambi argues that it was not her proselytization, but her feminism that made the Indian psyche other her. Kosambi makes it clear that her agenda is to reclaim the feminism of Ramabai of 19th century India, a period that held no discourse for the female for her to seek support of. Burton writes, Kosambi is interested in understanding Ramabai's feminism and the possibilities her writing offers for a glimpse into gendered subalternity, not to mention Ramabai's incessant activity as a scholar, reformer, anti-colonial critic, Christian convert, and translator of the Bible into Marathi. Significantly, Kosambi is repeatedly concerned with fixing a place for Ramabai in the Maharashtrian psyche. So Ramabai's reliance on the Christian sisters might have been her way of ensuring a support system and aid for achieving her ultimate motto of saving her sisters from the religious atrocities in their own homeland, educating and empowering them, a support which her own land or religion failed to provide. Her lone fight against the strong patriarchal networks of 20th century and the eventual success of Mukti Mission went unacknowledged in the history of Maharashtra, having been tactically carpeted under her proselytization, the tactics of holding herself responsible for her absence. An acknowledging of a single woman who nailed the presence of women power in the early centuries without the backdrop of a male support system, unlike her counterparts Ramabai Ranade or Anandibai Joshi, is understandably beyond the comprehension of a patriarchally megalomaniac social psyche. The celebration of Ramabai Ranade and Anandibai Joshi, the strong women reformers who worked as directed by their husbands, and the abandoning of Ramabai in the name of conversion is proof enough to show the misogyny of the male reformers championing the cause for women. The abandoning of Ramabai in the name of proselytization, the abandoning of Ramabai in the name of proselytization is to be seen as a politicized agenda